Leben, liebe Palästina, großer Zionisten. Lebe, lebe, lebe Palästina. Lebe, lebe, lebe Palästina. Lebe Palästina, großer Zionisten. Lebe Palästina, großer Zionisten.
Recently, the Israeli ambassador for the United Nations shredded the UN Charter in the General Assembly itself. He had come to the assembly well prepared, bringing a miniature shredding machine to carry out this act.
This is your mirror. So that you can see exactly what you are inflicting upon the UN Charter with this destructive vote. This is you are shredding the UN Charter with your own hands. Yes, that's what you're doing, shredding the UN Charter. Shame on you. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Israel.
Why did he shred the UN Charter? By shredding the UN Charter, Israel has declared that UN has lost its relevance and its legitimacy. Why should Israel feel that UN has lost its legitimacy? It is because that the UN General Assembly had voted in favor of Palestine that Palestine is eligible to be a member of the United Nations. But the Palestinians are the enemies of Jews. How can the UN vote in favor of Palestine, who are the enemies of Israel? It is this question which prompted Israel to shred the UN Charter. This prompts us to suspect that UN should have originally been formed for the sole advantage of the Jews. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. The UN was created to subserve the interests of the Jewish community of the world. Following World War I, which was a terrible mastermind of the Jews tried to create the League of Nations to control the events of the world to their advantage, just like the United Nations of today. But it did not succeed. Jews then created situations that resulted in the Second World War. To state it simply, they masterminded World War II, following which the Jews successfully created United Nations organization based on their failed experience on the League of Nations. According to the fundamental notion of the UN Charter, the UN was created to avert wars. It is ironic that the Jewish warmongers created United Nations to avert the very wars that they are fond of. That is the reason, even after the Constitution of the United Nations, wars dotted the history of the world continuously, including the Gaza war of today. The inherent nature of the Jews is to subjugate and rule over the world. That is what they do through UN, which they nucleated and had it formed following World War II. Hence, UN is not for averting wars. We all know that the Jews are behind every war in the world. This is not restricted to the modern day wars alone. Even the very ancient wars were also due to the Jews. The South Indian Ramayan War that happened 7,500 years ago, the South Indian Mahabharata War that happened 5,100 years ago, the South Indian Kalabra War that happened 1,700 years ago were all due to the Jews. I have listed only the major ancient wars of South India that were incited by the Jews. All these three wars are repeated again and again by the Jews eternally, both locally and globally. The First World War was actually the repeat of ancient Ramayanam War of South India. The Second World War was actually the repeat of ancient Mahabharata War of South India. Kindly watch my video, Shocking Truth on line 11. That video shall explain all with proof. The Third World War should happen as a repeat of ancient Kalabra War, which was followed by smallpox epidemic that Parsuram the Jew intentionally created. Same way, the corona pandemic was also man-made so that Kalabra War shall be repeated as World War III. Despite earnest efforts by the Jews, For the same, for the past few years, they are not succeeding yet in accomplishing it. Wars bring fortune to the Jews. They make money by funding both sides of the war, and they also make money selling arms to the warring parties. Creating famines, epidemic diseases, and wars are the gameplays that entertain and enrich the Jews. In a nutshell, United Nations organization was the mastermind of the Jews to keep the events of the world in their control in the name of preventing wars. But only a very few know that both World War I and World War II were actually the mastermind of the very Jews who were also instrumental in creating UN in the name of averting wars. Hence, UN was not created to prevent wars, but to use it in many ways for the sole advantage of the Jews. The UN Charter do reflect this malintention of the Jews. I will begin exposing this intrigue with a simple example. Do you know how many articles are there in the Charter? There are 111 articles. Aren't you puzzled by this number? Why this number? This number means cheating, and explaining it would be beyond the scope of this video. But please be assured that this number 111 represents cheating. You shall now understand why the number of articles of the UN Charter is 111. Through this number, the Jews symbolically and secretly state that UN was established by the Jewish secret societies to cheat the world. I will now read the preamble to the Charter and establish through simple examples that the spirit of the preamble is not reflected in the actual Charter, thus cheating the world. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save the succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, that is World War I and World War II, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women, and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom, and for these ends to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure by the acceptance of the principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims. Accordingly, our respective governments, through representatives assembled in the city of San Francisco, have exhibited their full powers, found to be in good and due form, have agreed to the present Charter of the United Nations, and do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations. This is the preamble to the UN Charter. It sounds so nice, isn't it? But the actual Charter of the UN does not reflect this noble theme. Article 2.1 of the Charter says the organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. But Article 4.2 of the Charter says the admission of any such state to membership in the United Nations will be effected by a decision of the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. Article 5 of the Charter says a member of the United Nations against which preventive or enforcement action has been taken by the Security Council may be suspended from the exercise of the rights and privileges of membership by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. The exercise of these rights and privileges may be restored by the Security Council. Article 6 of the Charter says a member of the United Nations which has persistently violated the principles contained in the present Charter may be expelled from the organization by the General Assembly upon the recommendation of the Security Council. I have given just a few examples only. Haven't you noticed the folly? Every important thing that the General Assembly does should be on the recommendation by the Security Council. That is, Article 2.1 speaks of sovereign equality of all its members, while Article 4.2, Article 5, and Article 6 put the onus on the Security Council alone and not on the General Assembly. Article 12 further restricts the role of General Assembly into the rubber stamp of the Security Council. I will read it now. While the Security Council is exercising in respect of any dispute or situation the functions assigned to it in the present Charter, the General Assembly shall not make any recommendation with regard to that dispute or situation unless the Security Council so requests. Do you understand? Without the nod of the Security Council, the General Assembly shall do nothing of importance. Now it is time to know who constitutes the Security Council. Article 23.1 states that the Security Council shall consist of 15 members of the United Nations, the Republic of China, France, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America shall be permanent members of the Security Council. The General Assembly shall elect 10 other members of the United Nations to be non-permanent members of the Security Council, due regard being specially paid to equitable geographical distribution. Don't you understand? The 5 big brothers, namely USA, UK, USSR, China, France, are the permanent members of the UN. Article 2.1 speaks of sovereign equality of all its members, but the composition of Security Council and its powers defined by Article 23.1 overrule Article 2.1. Don't you see that UN is a hypocritic organization? Article 24.1 further states, in order to ensure prompt and effective action by the United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, and agree that in carrying out its duties under this responsibility, the Security Council acts on their behalf. Article 25 further states that members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Yes, it is mandatory for the General Assembly to accept the verdict of the Security Council, but only when the 5 permanent members of the Security Council unanimously decide on anything, that thing shall be executed. If any one of the permanent members vote against any resolution of the Security Council, that resolution becomes null and void. This is called veto. Although the word veto is not used in the United Nations Charter, the power of veto originates in Article 27 of the Charter, which states each member of the Security Council shall have 1 vote. Decisions of the Security Council on procedural matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members. Decisions of the Security Council on all other matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members, including the concurring votes of the permanent members. Chapter 6 and Article 52 only involve non-binding recommendations, thus giving the permanent members an absolute veto over all binding UN sanctions, peacekeeping operations, membership admissions, member expulsions, and Secretary General selections. Any one of the permanent members may veto a resolution by casting a negative vote. However, a permanent member abstaining or a permanent member being absent does not count as a veto. In a separate article, the Charter also requires that amendments be ratified by all of the permanent members. In addition, ratifications cannot be abstained on. This gives the permanent members an even stronger absolute veto over any change to the absolute veto power. Due to all of the permanent members being considered great powers, the power of veto has also been called the great power veto or great power unanimity. Don't you see the hypocrisy? When Article 2.1 speaks of sovereign equality of all its members, most important decisions or the want of it is actually made by the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council alone. In 1945, and even to this day, most of these 5 permanent member nations of the UN Security Council are controlled by the Jews through their secret societies. For instance, USA is under the control of the Ashkenazi Jews, and that is the reason Israel is getting billions of funds from USA. Hence, this invariably means that UN itself is under the control of the Jews. Hence, the UN Charter is a plain mockery. Thus, the UN serves no real purpose other than helping the Jews operating the world to their evil advantage. I shall state Iraq War and the present Gaza War as 2 prime examples. Saddam Hussein of Iraq stated that he would be trading through euro, which just emerged as the currency of the European Union, and not through American dollar. For this sin, Saddam Hussein and Iraq deserved revenge by the American Jews. Iraq never had any weapon of mass destruction, while America maintained that it had in order to start an avenging war on Iraq. Even after UN observers inspected Iraq and cleared it of this charge, America carpet-bombed Iraq with their B-2 stealth bombers and destroyed it with genocide and looted Iraq of its gold reserve with impunity. UN facilitated this barbarism to happen. Saddam Hussein was also executed through so-called fair trial. Do you now understand how Jews use UN? As for now, everyone knows that Israel is committing genocide in Gaza and that America is abetting it. In 2012, the 5,000-year-long Kali Yuga defined by the Jewish hegemony ended, and from 2013 onwards, Satya Yuga, the era of truth, started. That is why the UN, which was the brainchild of the Jews, is standing for truth, at least symbolically. That is why the UN General Assembly voted in favor of Palestine, ensuring that Palestine is eligible to be a member of the United Nations. 143 members for and 9 members against and 25 abstaining. UN is very aware that what Israel is doing in Gaza is genocide. This being the case, global sanctions should have been imposed on Israel had the General Assembly had the authority for it. Contrary to the expected scenario, Israel is committing genocide in Gaza for the past 10 months with impunity. This is due to the fact that Security Council alone has the authority to decide on such issues and not the General Assembly, and that the Security Council is plagued by the veto power each of the permanent members possess. America is using its veto power in favor of Israel and against Gaza, blocking justice being done to the Palestinian people. Thus, the Security Council had always been stonewalling the meaningful outcomes from the UN. When all the 5 big powers who constitute the Security Council have veto power, nothing of use shall emerge from the UN. Hence, all these years, the whole world was fooled by the Jews through their UN. How did it happen? It happened due to the fear that the state leaders had on the secret societies of the Jews. We know what happened to Abraham Lincoln when he printed greenback dollar as the currency of the US. He was assassinated by the Jewish secret societies. Same thing happened to J.F. Kennedy when he questioned the intrusion of secret societies in the day-to-day functions of the American government. But today, most people of the world are aware of the nefarious activities of the Jewish secret societies and hence should overcome the fear psychosis and try their best to liberate the world from the clutches of the Jews. They should start by restructuring the UN and make it a just organization capable of delivering true justice. How to restructure the UN? I am suggesting a model for the same. The first thing to do is to dissolve the Security Council and make it null and void. The welfare of the whole world should be the collective responsibility of every individual living in it. This is attested by the preamble to the UN Charter 2. And to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, etc., etc. But the nations large and small can't have the same voting weightage as their populations vary. Hence, we have to ensure that every single individual of the world is having equal voice in the UN. This can be done as follows. Among the member nations, the smallest nation shall have one vote. Then every other member nation's population shall be divided by the population of that small nation. The quotient thus obtained for every other member nation shall be the voting merit of that member nation. Let us say that the smallest member nation, which has one vote, has a population of 1 million. Then the member nation that has a population of 100 millions shall have 100 votes in the General Assembly. This shall be called as the voting merit of that nation. This way, when a particular resolution comes for voting, some nations would vote in favor of the resolution and other nations would vote against the resolution. The total number of votes of the supporting nations should be counted by adding the voting merit of every supporting nation. The same way, the total number of votes of the opposing nations should be counted by adding the voting merit of every opposing nation. Of these two blocks, whichever thus have polled more votes would decide the fate of any resolution. Every act of the General Assembly should be decided this way only. This process would ensure, to a great extent, real justice to any issue that may arise. Only this practice would ensure peace and prosperity of the world. Hence, I request the people of the world to persuade your leaders towards restructuring the UN so that every individual of the world have equal voice in the decisions of the UN. This is the only way to keep the Jewish menace in check. Now that Israel itself had shredded the UN Charter, it had declared that the present UN Charter is null and void. It is a great moment in history. We should utilize this moment to restructure the UN. Hence, I appeal to the world leaders to shed your fear on the Jewish secret societies. Articulate your opinion and ask the fellow members to press for restructuring the UN. Restructure the UN so that every individual of the world have equal voice in it. Fellow citizens of the world, urge your leaders to restructure the UN. You have to press upon your leaders to act positively in this regard. If you desire a peaceful and prosperous world, we need to do this without fail and with urgency.